Okay, everybody hears me? Yeah. So thank you for inviting me this year. I've followed Dande for a while, and it's nice to be part of the festivities. So today I'm going to talk about kind of a self-help psychoanalysis of some work I've done over the last 12 years, and mostly in Croatia, through a kind of working theory of opening works and unfinishing figures. So the idea of the open work is a term that I borrow from Umberto Eco, who's an Italian theorist, novelist. In 1962, came up with an idea for how to liberalize the concept of artistic authorship and include the idea that works can be generated incompletely or openly and leave some elements of themselves, their content, to chance or to public participation. And interesting enough, he actually equated the two, randomness and public participation, as if they were really one and the same thing, which is somewhat problematic. So based on that idea, I felt I sort of shifted the focus. This is a kind of work in progress about the idea of how about if an open work works for fine art? My idea is more of looking at opening works. So assuming that works of culture, architectural works, design works, everyday objects have some intentionality. So as opposed to giving some openness to highly intentional fine art objects, assuming intention in unauthored or partly authored objects. And there's a lot of that in Croatia, from the city plan of Zagreb to everyday objects in the street. And in unfinishing figures is this idea that I'll work through so if opening works is a kind of relationship with context, unfinishing figures is a relationship with creative work for the non-fine arts, for architecture, for design, maybe even for politics, where we always consider the work as a platform, as a potential platform for future occupation, for future ideas. So what I'll do is, very quickly, the two research projects that I'm most happy with, Project Zagreb, which was co-authored with Yves Blau from 2007, which looked at rereading Zagreb as an archive, a physical archive and a real archive. And then from 2010, Peripheral Moments, Experiments in Architectural Agency, also with Actar, in their short-lived collaboration with Birkhauser in 2010, where I looked at the formation really of a kind of architectural scene in the post-war period. Those two research projects, I'll use those projects as kind of open works, or as opening of works, to frame two unfinished figures, let's call them. This is all work in progress, theoretically at least. Two projects, the Spatial Development Strategy, or Campus Borongaj, the programming for Campus Borongaj, which I collaborated with Bojan Balatic, who was the pro-rector for spatial development of the University of Zagreb between 2008 and 2011, and the Central Urban Scape, or Središnji gradski prostor, which I've worked on with Helena Paverniric since 2009. And both projects really grew out of the research I did on Zagreb, and both are collaborations not just with those two individuals, but with numerous other individuals. So I'll use those projects to talk about this idea, these linked idea of the opening works and unfinishing figures. So Project Zagreb, if you've seen the book, there's some interesting drawings, if nothing else. Read the Zagreb spatial practices at various scales, so Banja Jelačić square, forwards, as well as backwards. We found that by reading elements backwards and then projecting them forward, we could actually understand a more subtle intentionality that doesn't follow artistic norms, that follows other norms, other than artistic norms. And so that better understanding helped us understand what we call transition conditions, which became strategies focused on a particular objective, and then later became practices, conventions which afforded the city a semblance of equilibrium despite of its unstable, weak, politically, economically role in larger multinational empires. This method, again, was applied at the smaller scale, but it was also applied at the city scale, where, for example, the railway, highways, the military airports, regulation of the Sava River were complex elements that were often decided not in Zagreb, but in other capitals, Vienna, for example, Belgrade, Brussels now. And so the city itself, despite of this lack of control, we found a high degree of intentionality in projects that actually seemed almost unauthored, unfinished, incomplete. So I'll start with one of the most important case studies in Project Zagreb, which dealt with the so-called green horseshoe or Zagreb ring, began with an analysis, which you can barely see, but it's okay, I can explain it, of one of the formative events in Zagreb's history, which was the so-called rail debate, which Snježka Knežević researched and then I've continued to develop. From 1861 to 1878, basically Vienna and Budapest couldn't agree on the railway system for a dual monarchy, but they decided that Zagreb was going to be not a station on the railway, not a terminal station, but a waypoint. And really both capitals drew their own fantasies of optimal infrastructure onto the city with relatively little input, obviously, from the citizens or even from the elected officials that served in the various official parliaments of that time. But what the city developed through that debate, the city's objective was to maintain space for future development, while at the same time pushing away the railway, but at the same time pulling it in, because it was bringing, obviously, income, and also was being paid for by two competing entities with a lot more economic well-to-do than Zagreb had now or then. And so actually the green horseshoe, what we discovered, the green horseshoe was partially a response to keeping the railway at bay, so not so intentional at first, really a response to a transition condition, which then became much more intentional over time. So, very interestingly enough, you can barely see that, but the extension of Zrinjevac in 1877 was first planned as a university campus. It was planned as actually not even a university campus, a university and educational institution, partly because of complicated 19th century nationalistic reasons, partly because it needed an excuse, despite of not having the funds, to keep the railway at bay, to keep the railways far enough south to where a little provincial city could still imagine itself growing. So that project is considered a failed project by many historians. We found it to be a very successful project. It actually generated some practices that we found continue and that I've actually continued to use today. So for example, Milan Lanucci, who became the head urban planner, let's call him that, after 1877, after 1880, discovered that the green horseshoe, which didn't exist, which the city didn't own, which wasn't really formulated physically, could be used as a kind of concept to both attract certain institutions, to convince private development to not buy certain parcels that they wanted to buy, and to keep the Austrian and Hungarian authorities who were in conflict with each other away from certain zones. And so, as we discovered through this reading backwards and forwards, for example, a number of historians and a number of lay people in Zagreb compare Zagreb ring to Vienna ring, as we do in everything else in Zagreb. In this case, we found what was amazing about the green horseshoe, and maybe you remember this from some lectures 10 years ago, is that while the green horseshoe at first looks maybe like the ring, like a small ring, the process of its production was quite the opposite. So whereas in Vienna, a already defined former military space owned by really the emperor was officially by decree transferred to a kind of bourgeois space of representation, was planned first as an infrastructure, then as public institutions, and was only then opened up to private development. In Zagreb, the situation was quite the opposite. Zagreb was fighting with two different railway systems, pushing the railway back, but not too far back, fighting with local developers who could care less about all of these ambitions, and at the same time inventing a figure which didn't really exist, and which still doesn't really exist, but we think it exists, so that's important. And through that, generated a very different kind of set of practices that unfortunately, unless we read these failed plans, we lose. And we only see a physical comparison with a space that actually was generated in a totally different way. So this is my favorite drawing, actually. This is a working drawing from Project Zagreb, where I mapped all of the the attractions and repulsions that Lanucci was able to choreograph between 1880 and 1910. And a number of them were actually military programs. So the military barracks on the western part of the city. I even think this hospital was part of the roulette game. Obviously, the Austro-Hungarian Empire wanted them near the new railway. So not only was the railway going to be a blockage, these new programs were going to be a blockage. So Lanucci had to find a way to entice every one of these decision makers to move them to the west of the city. Because actually they were sometimes proposed these. Anyway, what was very interesting was, again, how this figure, this open work, let's call it, or unfinished figure, was used without actually existing as a very real strategy. And also important to note, not as a series of tactics, not as a series of minor moves. The minor moves were how it was realized, but the strategy was what was key here. This idea that despite of lacking ownership, despite of lacking the means, despite of lacking consensus, a strategy was necessary before the small tactics that we all sort of romanticize now could be placed, which of course was how the actual project was real. And in 1907, Lănuții revealed the strategy to the authorities in Budapest. He was really doing it very subtly. He was telling people about it in Zagreb, but not so much in Budapest. In 1907, he got a little bit arrogant, and he said, you know what, this is the new center of a much larger industrial city, which now I'm not going to hide anymore. I'm going to say, okay, we have military programs to the west, which are closing development to Chernomorets today. But we can now, since 1900, we can expand the railway loop so that the city can expand to the south and to the east. We can create 2 terminal stations on Glavni kolodvor and Zapadni kolodvor, the 2 stations. And we can imagine an eastern and southern expansion of the city where the Green Horseshoe is no longer the peripheral edge, which it still was in the minds of the citizens, but was actually a center of a new industrial city. And also, what was most interesting to the east, Lănuții developed a very complex, mixed-use, residential industrial zone, which is now Žitnjak, but which included both housing, but also mixed-use housing and fabrication facilities on the site of where Borongaj campus is proposed today, as well as an industrial harbor modeled on Frankfurt, actually, Frankfurt's harbor. And so a really complex set of programs and a very particular figure which connected Maksimir Park with the recently regulated Sava River. So even the discovery of this sort of washed out strip of conceptions was very important. So this plan was rejected primarily on military terms because Zagreb had become too important for the security of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at that time. And so changing the railway at all would risk the ability for the authorities to control, particularly Bosnia, but all of the region. So it was rejected. And a lot of, again, historians have seen it as a failed plan. And what I'll show you is that quite the opposite. Both the discipline in Zagreb, as well as, I would say, a kind of general consensus about what the city is, really realized this plan. This plan continued to influence development much later. So despite of the fact that in 1932, a lot of the larger moves were abandoned for a moment, and instead a military airport actually appears already in the plans in 1932, and a few small workers' Siedlungen, obviously following the trends, are planned. By 1947, Vladimir Antolić, in the first post-war general plan, also a failed plan, but not really a failed plan, actually explicitly cites Lănuți's plan of 1907 as the foundation for what people have interpreted as a new socialist, Le Corbusier-inspired plan, which actually is very much a rereading not just of the history of the city, but of a history of the ideas of a city, of the projections of a city. So you can see now Antolić already plans an eastern center for the city, which includes mixed-use developments, which includes also a university campus, which includes a terminal station now on the site of where Borongaj station is today, which would serve as one of the 2 entry stations into the city, allowing for the railway to either totally disappear or to be buried underground, or to be buried in a canal. So Chernomorets and Borongaj become terminal stations. They also become new polycentric centers for Zagreb, and of course Vukovarska Avenue, the proletarian brigades, becomes a new administrative center for Antolić's plan. Antolić's plan is also rejected, is supposedly a failed plan, and yet, as we'll see, continues to influence thought. The first realized general plan from 1970 then shifts the focus. It shifts the focus from these polycentric 3 centers along the east-west axis of Zagreb to a north-south axis. So now recognizing the old city center as valorizing one center, the new unrealized Trnje extension of the city center and a new center in Novi Zagreb, where the Museum of Contemporary Art is now located, which for many reasons is located there because of this plan, which was passed. But what's also interesting is that despite of abandoning the maybe larger schemes for the eastern and western parts of Zagreb, even Colatio continues an idea from Lanuzzi and from Antolić, which is to define very important transportation hubs in Črnomerec and in Borongaj, where a tram line, which is still in Gup, but it's changed recently, would go and connect to Maksimirska right there. Also, what Colatio is trying to do is continue to preserve one of Zagreb's green fingers. So that allows for sustainable urbanism much earlier than that term is used, allows for airflow and kind of ideal circumstances between the Sava River and Sljeme. And also what's interesting is at this time, though, in 1970, what's not drawn on this plan, which is the military airport, which is on Borongaj, which has been used, which continues to operate there, but which already Colatio imagines leaving one day and possibly moving to the new site of the passenger airport. Okay, so that was a little bit of rereading Zagreb to get us familiar with some issues, to show you where these ideas come from. And now I'm going to focus a little bit on the collaborative work with Bojan Balatic and others on developing a kind of urban strategy for the University of Zagreb over the last 5 years. And the concept here is the idea of the campus as an urban playmaker. So I don't really follow football, American or European, but it's a nice term, so I use it. Playmaker is someone who assists, obviously, a strategy. So in this case, the idea of Borongaj, 92-hectare site given from the Ministry of Defense to the Ministry of Education around 2007, or was it given, was it not given, who really owns it? That's not so clear. But either way, a very large parcel of land, one of the largest publicly owned parcels of land in Zagreb, itself is already a kind of large opportunity, a kind of space to be used for something. Here's an aerial of it. But what Bojan and I realized early on through research of Zagreb's own development was that the site itself, as large as it was, its key role was not so much as a large campus site, but actually as an opportunity to really rethink the spatial organization of the University of Zagreb as a whole. Not as a new campus versus old faculties, but really as 3 campuses, where 3 campuses could actually, 2 that basically already existed, the historical campus on the western broken arm of the horseshoe, medical campus to the north, obviously some clusters of student housing and sports fields to the south, and where Borongaj really, whatever program it will go there, and who knows what will go there, really its ability to reshuffle those relationships and to continue to develop the city, not in a programmatic way, but in a strategic way, was really its opportunity. So as large as 90 hectares are, the opportunities were much, much larger. So in a workshop conducted in 2008 with faculty and students from Harvard University, the ETH in Zurich, and Zagreb University, and some of them are here, generated a couple of very important ideas for us. It generated the program for the competition brief, which was very useful, 5 days, pretty efficient. It also Tonči Žarnić's group developed this very useful diagram for us, where we started to understand, looking again back at Lanuzzi, looking at Antolić, looking at both ideas, but also incomplete physical infrastructures that could easily be completed through the use of the site. The idea that just as the Green Horseshoe, an entity which in its initial state was a kind of academic campus, helped direct a fairly chaotic city in a somewhat directed way, so too could Borongaj help direct the development of the eastern part of Zagreb, which already had about 200,000 citizens, which also on the western half was quite urbanized, which also had a lot of amenities. And so, again, thinking about this well beyond the role of the university as simply institutional, as an educational institution, but the university, like the ETH and like Harvard, as a kind of cultural agent in the development of the city, at a time when other institutions are either too dysfunctional or too scared to take those roles on. So from that diagram, Bojan and I developed this kind of conceptual diagram looking at these 3 campuses. And then also realizing, again, this potential, which was a hidden potential, but one based on these supposedly failed plans, which in fact were partially realized, that, for example, the tram network of Zagreb could be easily completed and formed into a loop mostly through the land that is currently held by the University of Zagreb, and would finally create a kind of workable public infrastructure. University of Zagreb could also, an orange lobby for a kind of S-Bahn type rail connection, connecting both its own institutions as well as generating new stations along what is hopefully one day going to be at least a slightly decommissioned rail line, and which now is possible. And again, how we could also continue to, whatever the program is in Borongaj, you could help continue to preserve the green zones, help preserve kind of provide cultural programs for the eastern part of the city that are beyond university. So again, this kind of, unfinished figure, you could say, was really the result, whatever happens in Borongaj was really the result of this 3-year process, which looked at Project Zagreb and looked at really the university's needs today. Also, the research through the peripheral moment, particularly the research I conducted with the UHA, the Society of Architects, on all of the public competitions between 1999 and 2010, looking at not so much just the work itself, but the makeup of juries, the amount of workshops that were prepared the programs, and discovering kind of a pattern that obviously if you spend a little bit more time on programming and picking a jury, you might get a better project. Whether or not the architect is particularly a genius or not. And this obviously reinforced our own belief that preparing a kind of competition for Borongaj was as important as the proposal itself. So by 2010, we prepared not just a program brief with Mladen Joršić, who was then included, but also prepared a series of workshops, a special number of CHIP, which provided Croatian architects some ideas about campus planning, since no Croatian architects had at that time completed, maybe certainly proposed, but completed a campus plan. And the two projects that really stood out in the competition were the first and second prize winners, Niraj Plus and second prize 3LHD, simply because they did their homework. I mean, whatever the projects, the quality. The projects are, what we were surprised as a jury was that most of the other competitors had proposed really urbanism. And those two projects had actually taken into account 3 years of research that the university had provided all of the competitors, and had really generated what we thought were actually not just urbanism, but campuses with the concept. And I'm not going to go into the specifics of the project itself. Here's a kind of external view. What we were really also, what was mentioned in the brief and what we were really interested in was not just a campus, but also a kind of experimental space, like the Velosheim had served in the past, where in addition to providing, again, a kind of urbanistic strategy for the city, in addition to solving the university's space planning needs, we were hoping to use this piece of land as an experimental space where new forms of sustainable urbanism could be developed through where the university really allowed for a kind of experimentation. Another thing that was important, and again, why both the first and second prize winners were significantly superior, was that we really prepared a kind of survey of successful mixed-use urban-generating campuses, the UVA, and which is kind of a paradigmatic, actually early 19th, late 18th century campus in the States, which combines faculty, student, housing, even sustainable food production with education and a library. Harvard campus, which actually looks like a very planned campus, but was in fact a series of incomplete projects, very much like Zagreb, which also combines housing, institutions, educational spaces, and also campus-like spaces in Zagreb, like Zaporozhye, for example, or the historic campus itself, or the ETH, and we found that both in terms of scale and in terms of programmatic mix, it was very important that this mix was continued through this proposal, which is why it was chosen. And these are all at the same scale. Another thing I conducted in parallel with the program, which was very useful, was I was teaching some courses at Harvard at the time, and I actually did some empirical research. I would ask students and faculty to simply map out where they lived and their kind of daily routines to give us a sense of scale. What is the footprint of a kind of sustainable campus today? Not just sustainable both environmentally but also culturally. So on the left you have the circle, and the white circle is actually one of Hrvoje's developmental units of 7 faculties with housing, and we found that it actually, interestingly enough, well, and we provided this to the competitors as well, and he used that, others did not, but he, and 3LHD used it as well. We found that this was actually kind of optimal scale for flexibility as well as interactivity. So you can see then overlapping Harvard campus over at Borongaj, which is actually bigger than Harvard campus currently. You can see the kind of clusters. This is why the clusters in the scheme are actually placed the way they are, that even the site itself needs a kind of local neighborhood scale. Anyway, and what we were also happy to see in both first and second schemes was this idea that, like Lanuzzi, like Antolić, the Nearich Plus scheme also imagined a future scenario where Borongaj itself was a kind of playmaker for new sites, for connectivity between the forestry faculty and the current site, even imagining in the future a kind of Olympics sports site on the south near the river. So again, in a way, I would say even archiving a certain knowledge, right? When we do a competition, we generate a lot of ideas, and then usually half of them we throw out, and we give some nice renderings. But what's interesting about Lanuzzi's work, Antolić's work, and I would say the Nearich Plus project is in a way packaging a very intensive set of ideas, which really can literally serve as a platform, not metaphorically, for future projects in a very continually unstable city. Okay. So the plan itself was also translated into an urban plan, which means it lost a lot of its qualities. But again, it's something that is interesting as a process and is worth considering how a very specific set of ideas, particularly by an architect who's very narrative, who's very interested in storytelling, how we translate that into a series of banal regulations. And that's an ongoing process with which I have nothing to do. So I'd leave that up to you to find out more. Okay, so the second project I'm going to talk about is Središnji gradski prostor, which you could translate as central urban space, but I think central urban scape is a little bit more appropriate, and if nothing else, catchier. So in 2008, for similar reasons as the Borongaj campus, I was invited by Helena Parvaniric to collaborate on a revised proposal for an even more complex and controversial site in the geographic heart of Zagreb, part of the so-called central axis, which really doesn't exist, which we named a central urban scape. So going back to the 1907 plan for Lanuzzi, you can see here, Lanuzzi was hoping to actually only open up the gap between Zapadni kolodvor and Glavni kolodvor and remove the railway from there, hoping that that would be enough to connect the two sides of the city, because even at that time, Grede was too controversial of a site. It was too important for Austro-Hungarian shipping and military to be removed, even by an ambitious plan like this. But nevertheless, the south, this is really the beginning of a serious attempt to connect across to the south of the city 100 years ago. By the time Antolić comes in, he foolhardily believes that he can actually make a much larger gap in the barrier. So all the way between Črnomerec and Borongaj, current campus. Antolić imagines, again, as I've mentioned before, a removal or at least a lowering of the railway. And again imagines, that's not me, continues actually from 1930 some kind of north-south axis, which is not necessarily a Champs-Élysées, but some kind of axis, and obviously places a kind of administrative zone to the east-west and imagines a cultural zone to the north-south along the axis, one that he himself admits that even in the post-war sort of socialist context is probably beyond the means of the current city, but is something to be reserved for a future better time. And so again, we looked at this in Project Zagreb extensively, tried to understand the kind of what we call the many unfinishings or unfinished figures of the Green Horseshoe, a number of extensions to the west, to the south, to the east. But if you look at historical photographs, so these are disciplinary studies, but if you look at the kind of these photographs which you can find in cafes in Zagreb, the kind of collective understanding of an expansion to the south despite of the very serious barrier of the railway, despite of a very different world to the south of the tracks. So this is a 1920s photograph. The Esplanade is finished. just recently, this idea of a kind of expansion, even visually, in these photographs, right? Or the idea of, and then the reality in this aerial of, by the 1930s, that actually Zagreb's development as an industrial city already created a kind of pseudo-rural, pseudo-urban set of interesting, kind of informal villages, really, from immigrants in a kind of two sides of, two very different sides of the city, which, as most of you know, Orson Welles exploited in a very interesting way in the process or the trial. So by the 30s, so that's the situation by the 30s. By 1958, a more operative mayor, Holjevac, and Colatio finally said, screw it, we can't really solve Trnje, it's too complicated. We're going to actually just jump, not just the Sava River, which was the political terminology, but Trnje itself, and literally cut across south of the river, build the bridge here today, which until the flood actually literally had houses right in between, kind of, and created, and also unintentionally created a very interesting space between the roads. But Colatio really, in his own mandate, focused on the western extension, on the extension of the university, the Aleja Nauke, to the south. And the Središnji gradski prostor, or central urban scape, remained unfinished, but quite formed, quite specific already as a space. So if we go back to Colatio's plan, we see in the middle of the plan, actually the entire space is left as a void. So it's not built. Though you can see actually the physical structure is more on the edges. So already not an axis in the 19th century way, the way that many have interpreted, but as a series of spaces. Also, what's interesting is, again, by the 1960s, that space already, despite of not having any physical boundaries, despite of not being a classic axis in the, again, the Parisian or even Viennese sense, is actually a space in itself. Particularly this photo here, it almost has a kind of, it's a surface, it's a green surface, it has its identity. In fact, it holds a very discrete, very chaotic fabric around itself, which is a kind of reversal of what we think of as public space making, where in fact the buildings define the space, and the space in many ways is a passive space. In this space, which is what's sort of amazing and unique about it, it actually has the job of holding together a very discrete set of objects. So that space remained a very powerful void until 1978. So the Americans very opportunistically chose this site as the stage of a centennial exhibition, a 200-year exhibition of America's first liberal revolution, as someone on Facebook just called it recently. So a light installation within the green bowl itself, and a Bucky Fuller Dome with a history of the American Revolution in '78, which also traveled to Afghanistan, which is interesting, in the same year, placed where the very figural monument to the 900-year existence of Zagreb is today by Branko Silađin. And in 1989, already the space starting to have a little bit more of an identity, or it always had an identity, but a more heavy identity, let's say. In 1989, finally the city of Zagreb decides that it's one of the few cities in Yugoslavia without a major monument to Marshal Tito, and so Vojin Bakić, an expert in these things, it wins a first place competition for one of his very abstract political statues, a little north of what is the Green Bowl, right between the City Hall and Lisinski. So obviously 1989, not a good year for political monuments, but in 1992, 3 years later, one of the first public competitions of the recently independent Croatia, a progressive jury rejected a number of neo-19th century proposals for a very conventional axis in favor of a scheme by Nerić and Nerić, one that embraced the character of the void, one that was to be a void that was to be programmed, articulated, but also maintained as a void. So again, a kind of deep knowledge of the city through a kind of reading backwards and reading forwards, which I think, again, generated, while it wasn't realized in this way, again, generated knowledge, left a kind of archive. So meanwhile, in 1999, following the idea of a kind of southern center. A competition was held for the Museum of Contemporary Art, which Igor Franić won. And literally, the Museum of Contemporary Art, in a history, in a practice which is very typical in Zagreb, leaped across from the old town far down to the city center in an effort to really reinforce the development of a cultural center for Novi Zagreb, which is still yet to be completed, but I think at least conceptually is a valid point. Meanwhile, the Green Bowl in 2007 remains a charged void. This is a magical land, as Nerić called it. It remained somewhat hosting informal soccer games, as well as more formal political campaigns, such as the election of a mayor, back when he still did not have his own political party. But again, the idea of a very strong space, which now again had a weight of its own, which wasn't simply an empty space, which actually was a defined space. So by 2008, the same mayor decided to reopen the issue of the central urban scape, 20 years after the initial competition with Nerić, in which Helena was nice enough to involve me in, following a similar dance as the one going on with Borongaj, where we did something similar, which was we also went one step backwards and hopefully 2 steps forwards in this reading of this site. So this is an artistic interpretation of what may have been the original brief. I'm not saying it was, but 2 representational fountains on the entry to the city, which really only considered the experience of the driver, not so much the pedestrian, and also in a way, anyway, read the space as simply an empty space, not a charged void. For us, for Helena and I, the importance of the spatial qualities of the current space, as well as the problems of an east-west connection for the residents of Trnje and for the users of the National Library and the law courts to the northeast, seemed as important as the issue of kind of urban iconography, which had been set by the city administration. So again, stepping backwards, thanks to Borongaj Airport being a military target in World War II, we actually got some pretty good aerials of the city in the 40s, much better than the Yugoslav Air Force was able to do in the 50s. So this is a 1944 aerial done by American fighter pilots of what the site was. Literally, it's hard to believe, but you can see it, of the site in 1944. And so one of the things that we noticed when we started doing these studies was, one, like many parts of the city, not only were ideas incomplete but a number of infrastructural elements, a number of fabric elements, which in other places would have been totally demolished, were still there, were still active, were little bleeding limbs, let's call them. And we also started to understand that even in this state in 1944, there was an interesting tripartite division between 2 voids and a kind of cluster with connections before. So we thought that was an important idea. We also, the idea of this kind of in-between moment in 58, where literally, you have the traffic, you have this formal high-speed entry into the city, but you also have pedestrian access, you also have Trnje, you also have floating Corbusian volumes. Why is that not as valid of a spatial conception as a kind of formal access with big, heavy buildings? So we thought that's important, and that's something that was already defined in the 92 proposal by Nerić. So again, we wanted to inform the articulation of the current void. Instead of only addressing the experience of formal entry into Zagreb by car, we sought to address the experience of the pedestrian through east-west pedestrian tunnels, whose placement should be informed by the still existing parcel logics of Trnje. So we also didn't want cuts across this space, but really lassos that, and also wanted to figure out a way to not necessarily evoke the history of these former rural buildings, but to really kind of use the concurrent massing of the space today to help inform where the future fountains would be placed. And at the same time, while we were adding all of this program, the importance here was to maintain the void, maintain the charge void. How do you place something in this space while at the same time keeping it open? Okay, so, and also starting to manipulate the landform itself to create more nuanced spaces, again, while maintaining what is a really amazing void in the city. Okay. So at times the space could be nearly empty, and at other times could be full. It could provide at least 2 distinct experiences from the north-south viewer and above, and the east-west user from below. And again, the idea of the horseshoe, these extensions, not being axes, but as being kind of clusters, as being networks. This is a new diagram. It's too small to see, but that really the even the fountains themselves, they're not necessarily a building, not necessarily a landscape, but a kind of constellation amongst other constellations. And another thing that was really interesting during the research was to discover that the view itself, not in a formal axial way, but in more of a landscape landform way, was being constructed from the 19th century on. So Antolich's drawing here, which actually borrows the towers from Le Corbusier's scheme for Buenos Aires, nevertheless also borrows a very particular reading of a series of panoramic photographs of the city, which imagined an axis which was never there. So that seems like a really interesting idea. Tosho Dabatz also captured that same axis through a kind of a very important photo, which has a sort of a kind of knowledge about the potential of that site. And in one of these early diagrams that we developed, the idea again of a kind of void, which continues to construct this landform, not this axis. One that can also have a density, but also have an emptiness at the same time, which is something that obviously fountains do, but are not always asked to do. And again, like the 1877 scheme for the campus, which was really there also to direct private development through and break up very large parcels, we also had an eye towards a very simplistic regulation plan for Trnje, which also imagined very large blocks, which were drawn, again, with this idea of a kind of 19th century axis. And so hoping that as many as possible of these punctures could set up a finer grain for development. One that wasn't just on paper, but was both culturally and physically in space itself. And even the idea of the fountain itself, not as an object to be viewed from afar, which in a space like this would require thousands of nozzles, but as a space, a medium even, to engage through direct interaction. So these are some early studies of what a kind of water room might be like. These are from 2008. And how even smaller clusters of space could be formulated. And again, how even how we could borrow not just the amazing quality of the void, but also the kind of the light pollution generated by traffic, how it could become part of this multisensory landscape, or vyšečulny krajolik, which is a direct translation for those of us who enjoy that. So again, 2 of the 5 fountains have been constructed, forming a southern entry into the city, as was desired by the city itself, and they already participated in a multi-sensory environment. These are some little stop frame, rough, handmade, and they frame small social spaces in a still empty void, hopefully. Where, interestingly enough, one of the things that I think Helena and I both really enjoy is somewhat of a surprise is how the pedestrians, the users, actually get backlit, which is something you can actually see now from the car. These are just some stop frames, and one of the most important aspects of the project for us, the pedestrian tunnels, which received significant use today, and create a kind of connection which never really existed before. Minimal pathways and lighting, reinforcing the existing geometry of the void. Watery volumes oscillating from singular elements to in a field to nothing, softening the more presumptuous neighbors to their east or west, hopefully. And small plazas around the fountains, which are actively used. Their use informed slightly by the modifications of the terrain, and also their use hopefully informing, which has informed hopefully the next phase of construction. And some of the discussions on the site, some of the elements which weren't part of the project, but which were included by a very energetic mayor who couldn't really wait for our designs for seating, but which have also taught us a lot about how we can modify some of those elements as well. And I think we're particularly pleased with the scale of the topography. So you can see how it actually serves both as circulation and as division, as well as the user's intuition about the spatial potentials of the fountains themselves, as spaces to occupy and not only objects to view. And so this young lady and her mom have figured out how to meet each other. The repetition and difference of the fountains has also allowed for different constituencies to coexist. So the teenagers on the right, the families on the left, very different uses in one singular space. And one of the last issues, which I think is still interesting, and maybe more unfortunately interesting for Croatia, is the oversaturation of iconography, which is legible here, but is totally legible when I present this in Kuwait, that this axis already has, and that we know from the research of Project Zagreb, those icons change, but the spaces do not. And so, knowing the iconographic evolution of Zagreb, we thought instead of adding more icons, it was more important to provide frameworks, like this projection of the construction foreman's, I think, niece's favorite monkey, as well as, you know, transnational symbols, which may go away, who knows, national ones, and local ones. And another thing which is great is that during the process of the incompleteness of the site itself, it's very similar uses, such as different kinds of lectures, yoga, have occurred, which is in an interesting way very much a deja vu of the carefully staged public interventions and uses of the Green Horseshoe as it was still being formed both as a physical space and as a concept. And again, so the idea of continuing to unfinish both these, well, to open works that are both seemingly overly intentional, overly known, like the Green Horseshoe, treating them both as partly intentional and partly incomplete, and making sure that the interventions that you add to a city are unfinished, that provide platforms for discussion and for evolution. So since it's 45 minutes, I could show you a little bit of coastal work, or I could just stop it there. So just stop it there. Okay. Thank you very much.